Hello, this is Trevor Witt with Kairos Geospatial. In this video, I'll be talking about using drone photography for road and bridge inspections. To start off, you need to be thinking about what you want from your data. Think about why not photogrammetry or LiDAR. What does individual photos and videos give you that those other technologies don't? I always point people towards the simplest use case first. And so in this case, photos and videos, they are the most simple. They're the easiest to use. They don't require much, if any, post-processing, and they're easy for other people to understand. Some of the limitations, though, of photos and video is they're not to scale. You're not really able to make any quantitative measurements on this imagery because of the distortion of the lens. So we're talking about this is all qualitative versus quantitative data. Photos and videos absolutely require good field notes and understanding that data and recording those notes right after you collect it. I've had a lot of experience where you can go back to a file and then forget some of the nuance of what you experienced out in the field. So it's important to take those notes and associate them with the data right away. Be thinking about your file naming, backup, and archiving. And again, coming back to this core of how this data will be used to make decisions. And then there's this case of too little data or too much. It's always better to err on the side of too much data, but you also don't want to collect so much that it becomes an unnecessary burden of trying to sift through gigabytes of photos and videos when only a few may do for your use. So things you need to be thinking about related to camera specifications relate to sensor size. So a large sensor is going to have more data, ability for more detail, but it's going to require a larger drone. Don't get fooled. Megapixels aren't everything. Just because a sensor has more megapixels doesn't make it necessarily better. One of the things to note is you've seen this on your cell phones is that a high megapixel count can also lead to high noise in low light conditions. So that's just something to consider. And then the lens. You can't change the lens for most drone cameras. Usually those are fixed or an integrated part of the drone. And then also be thinking about your focal length. There's this term also called equivalent focal length that I won't cover in detail here, but it relates to the classic 35 millimeter size of a camera. Be thinking of either fixed or variable focal length. So a variable focal length lens is something like a zoom lens is a more common name. And the longer the focal length, the more zoom and the less field of view or the less total area you're able to see in the image. So here's a little figure kind of explaining the different sizes, typical sizes of sensors. And you can pause that, kind of explore around and see those common sizes. Sensor settings, so the key settings related to our exposure or how bright the image is are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. In some cases, auto is fine. Just leave it on auto and it'll adjust these three, but it's important to know these three settings and how they can affect the quality of the image. It's also important to understand focus and whether your drone is auto-focusing or if you need to manually focus the image or before each capture. White balance goes often ignored. A lot of times it's set on auto, but this can lead to some variability in how the images look. So I always say it's better to fix it to sunny or cloudy, depending on what the conditions are. And then it's also important to look, very common, there's a de-warping setting or an image enhancement setting where the drone will do its own internal enhancement of the image. And just, you need to be intentional on whether you want this or not. This is usually set for the more artistic sort of image taking. It makes a better looking image, but it's important to know that that image is being edited on board the drone. Whereas taking that setting off, it would be just the normal image. So here's a good figure explaining ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, and just the balance between each of these to ultimately reach your exposure. You typically want an exposure of 0 or a little bit negative, like a negative 0.3 or 0.7, because you can always brighten up an image and post-processing software. But if an image is too bright to start with, that data is lost. So if you have a really reflective surface, that data will be a void in your imagery, essentially. So knowing about shutter speed, it's the amount of time the imaging sensor is exposed to light. It's measured in fractions of a second. And the longer exposure, the more light, the brighter the image, but the larger chance of motion blur. This is less of an issue for single images, but as we get into talking about photogrammetry where the drone's moving or you have a subject area that's moving, you will see this blur occur. The aperture is the size of the opening that's allowing light to hit the sensor. It works a lot like the iris, or your iris, and how much light is let through your pupil. The unit's measured as an f-stop or an f number. It's a ratio. It's not that intuitive until you get the hang of it. So a 2.8 is a large opening, while a 16 is a small opening. In drone imaging, you want to stay away from those large aperture openings because you'll see this dark perimeter around the image, especially in the corners. And that's a term called vignetting. So really you want to typically stick with those middle values. Those are usually the best aperture to use. And then the ISO is the sensitivity of the imaging sensor. It's a unitless measure. The smaller the number, the less sensitive the image, but it's going to be darker. And the larger number, the more sensitive, the brighter the image is going to be, but you'll see kind of some grainy, sandy sort of noise in the image. The sensors are getting a lot better with this. You saw this more as an issue in older sensors, again, thinking 10 years ago when I was first working with this technology, but it can still be an issue, especially in low light conditions. So always ideally you're capturing data with a good bright sun, ideally plus or minus 2 hours of solar noon. Those are the best lighting hours of the day to collect to give you the most flexibility in your image settings. And again, there's that note talking about it's always better to have a little bit darker of an image than an image that's too bright. So what are some of the things that can go wrong? Images that are too dark or too bright, that's an exposure issue. Images that are blurry, you either have motion blur or there's an issue with your focus. And then are the images too noisy? That would be related to your ISO setting. And it's important to think with any sort of flying, thinking about your flight settings. A lot of these drones that are on the market now have obstacle avoidance sensors. So you need to be aware, especially with road and bridge inspections, when you're flying close to objects, be aware of the technology that's on board your drone, whether it's going to let you even fly close enough to capture a quality image, and whether or not you're comfortable in turning some of those settings off. So that's an important thing to think about. Related also to weather, if it's really windy, is it going to be pushing your drone into an object? Because the last thing we want to have happen is for you to collide with that object. Being aware of these return to home issues. So that's important, particularly for the underside of a bridge inspection. If you're flying under a bridge, a lot of these drones have return to home features. You need to know and likely have the setting, return to home setting, turned off, because the last thing also you want to happen is to reach a low battery and then that drone begins to return home. It increases in altitude and then it'll fly right into the underside of that bridge deck. And so you don't want that to happen. So in that, you always want to have plenty of battery. And then also you want to make sure your settings are set up in such a way where if you lose or happen to lose GPS signal, that it's not going to initiate a return to home. That you always give yourself plenty of room between your drone and whatever object you're inspecting. And then last, as a safety measure, it's important to think of the airspace that's around you. Always ask the proper permissions in controlled airspace. And then particularly in rural areas, be mindful of the growing season with aerial applicators flying around. The crop dusters can be the ones that are flying the lowest and cause the most hazard and flying in the same airspace as drones. So please be aware of that as well. And so with that, concludes this video about using basic photography for road and bridge inspection.